Chris currently serves as a technical sales and market development manager for Emulsions from Creighton Polymers Paving and Roofing Business Unit, headquartered in Houston, Texas. Received a BS in chemical engineering from Ohio University and a master's in chemical engineering from the University of Notre Dame. He spent 14 years in the asphalt industry, primarily focused on polymer modified emulsions and hot mix paving binders, as well as polymer modified roofing membranes. He's an active member of AMAP, AIAEMA, and various regional preservation partnerships and user producer groups. Please welcome Chris.
Thanks, everybody. This is actually a presentation that the chairman of the Emulsion Task Force, Colin Franco, put together for the AASHTO meeting earlier this summer in Pittsburgh, and I just kind of borrowed from it and then condensed it down for the meeting here today in Bozeman. But I'll be talking about basically the Emulsion Task Force. Jason mentioned this in his presentation when he was talking about FHWA structure and Office of Asset Management and the PPETG. So there will be a little introduction about the relationship of the ETF to the ETG, and then we'll focus on what the ETF's been doing over the last 2.5 years or so in terms of promoting specifications and practices into AASHTO for various pavement preservation treatments. The PPETG, I'm sure there's lots of people here are familiar with the PPETG, but it was established in 1991 when Jim Sorensen was still with us and with the FHWA. And the idea of the Pavement Preservation Expert Task Group was to promote, the institutionalization of concepts of preservation, and ultimately, many years later, became the parent group for this Emulsion Task Force. The mission of the PPETG, I think probably most people here have heard this before, but essentially was designed and put into place to improve the state of the practice in pavement preservation by working with all the stakeholders and industry agencies and academia. The goals, we don't need to go over that. Working agenda, implement pavement preservation, expand training, all the stuff that we've already kind of talked about somewhat this afternoon fell under the original mission statement and purview of the PPETG. And ultimately, in the case of what I'm going to talk about today, was a sanctioning body and a supporting body for this Emulsion Task Force, which was set up a few years back underneath the PPETG. And we've already talked about MAP 21, so this ties in pretty well, I think, as well to why preservation is important, especially now that there's going to be performance measures around funding, for various state projects and treatments. Is that this is our typical right treatment on the right road at the right time approach based on a pavement condition index is probably no more important now, or more important now than it ever was. Especially again with MAP 21 coming into play, like we've already talked about. So that's just a real quick overview. I didn't want to spend too much time there. I wanted to get into the meat of the matter. And essentially the Pavement Preservation Expert Task Group, up until very recently, the last time it met was in May of 2011 in Oklahoma City. And at that time, the Emulsion Task Force had been around for a couple of years, and we had done a little bit of work around the PPETG, but then the PPETG basically went on hiatus based on some reorganization that had happened within FHWA and the Office of Asset Management and other areas. I think that's right, Larry. Wasn't that the last meeting was in Oklahoma City? Because it was around one of the pavement preservation partnership meeting that year. So from that point on, basically both the PPETG and the ETF pretty much just disbanded what we were collectively working on. And then in the summer of 2013, Larry, Colin Franco, and some other stakeholders in the emulsion industry came up with an idea to try to bring the Emulsion Task Force back online, even though the ETG at that time wasn't back in full force. And we had a meeting at the Rhode Island DOT in July of 2013 and kind of reconstituted the ETF to continue what we had done in the few years leading up to 2011 when the ETG was put on hiatus, so to speak. But the original mandate of the ETF was to advance the effort to develop performance-based methods and specifications for emulsions. So you'll notice the word performance in there. And encourage adoption of uniform national standards within AASHTO and FHWA. And as I mentioned, we got back together in 2013 and met in Rhode Island, and then over the course of the next, several months, one of the first things we had to do within the ETF then was to reestablish the structure of the ETF, because it was maybe not very well represented in terms of the stakeholders in the emulsion industry and the preservation industry. So if you looked at the role now, it encompasses all the major industry organizations like EMA, ARA, and ISA, several academic institutions. Gary's here from CSU Chico. He's a chairman of one of the subcommittees. The state DOTs are heavily represented. FHWA, Jason Dietz is the primary rep to the FHWA. We have Mike Voth from the Central Federal Lands that's involved, Larry from the National Center, Jim Molthrope from FP Squared, and then a number of emulsion producers and contractors. So it's very, well represented in terms of all of the stakeholders within the emulsion and pavement preservation industry. Currently, under the ETF, we have basically 6 different subcommittees. Residue recovery and testing design group, which would be for spray and mixtures. Spray being, say, chip seals, fog seals, tack coat. Mixtures being microsurfacing, slurry seal, for instance. Supplier certification and QA, which Todd Shields is currently chairing from Indiana. Recycling emulsions is Todd Thomas from Colas, and Steve Cross is working with him from ARRA. And then Darren Haslett from TxDOT is heading up the research group. And then this ties into what we'll talk about in just a minute. We had to set up basically, to break this all down. So we got back together in 2013. We decided collectively as a group we needed to restructure, and we wanted to continue moving forward to try to move existing specifications within the emulsion industry into AASHTO, and then ultimately work towards a performance-based system of specifications within AASHTO and FHWA. That's the ultimate goal. So there's really kind of a phase 1 and phase 2. But what we found out pretty quickly was there were a few people in the group that were very well versed in AASHTO, but a lot of us, including myself, didn't really understand how AASHTO worked when it comes to submitting specifications and design practices and things. It's actually a fairly, in-depth process. So one thing we saw is that if you looked at all the methods we were proposing and the treatments we were going to look at, you had some existing specs out there in AASHTO, namely M140, M208, and M316, which we could work from and then reference back into the applications we were going to work on for design and best practices and these kinds of things. So we set up this special working group, which Mike Voth chairs up from the Federal Highway, Central Federal Lands group, to coordinate between the other subcommittees to make sure the material specs match up with what they're doing on the design and best practice side and construction guide side. So something to point out too is that one of the things that we really got done, one of the big things we got done initially in the first couple of years from like 2009 to 2011 when the ETF was first working, before we went on leave, so to speak, for a couple of years, was one of the high-level objectives was we test emulsions at very high temperatures to recover residue, which is not indicative of what happens on the road. So there's been a lot of work that's gone on trying to come up with a low-temperature recovery method in a short enough amount of time that it would be usable by an emulsion producer, an agency, to generate, QC/QA type properties on emulsion residue. So one thing Arliss had worked on, in the first couple of years was getting that ASTM method for low temperature recovery over into AASHTO. So that was a pretty big deal to get that over into AASHTO, because we need to reference that in some of the other specs and have everything within the AASHTO format. So that was, again, one of the big things that we were working on. So low temperature recovery was probably the single biggest thing we got done in that first couple years within AASHTO. We talked about this. There it is, low temperature recovery method. So right now, there's ongoing samples going out and data being taken. And, for everyone here that doesn't know what low temperature recovery means, there's a couple different methods out there. The preferred one currently is was developed by Darren Haslam and TxDOT several years ago. It's been an ASTM for a while. It's been an AASHTO now for a couple of years. But it involves drawing down a thin film of emulsion and then drying it in an oven at 60 degrees C for 6 hours. So it's 140 Fahrenheit for 6 hours. So if you look at what we're doing today, you've got distillation at, say, 350 to 500 Fahrenheit for an hour, plus or minus, and then you have oven evaporation, which is basically 3 hours. So we're not quite in the same time frame, but it's getting closer. There also is currently Jerry Ranke at Matthey has been working on a vacuum version of this method, basically, which would bring it down into that 3 hour time frame. So we're getting to the point where we can probably have a reliable, reproducible method very in the near future to recover emulsions in a short enough period of time that it would actually make sense from an industry and agency perspective. Okay, so we got back together. We kind of continued off where we left in 2011 and basically, kind of went over the mission again, which basically was, again, performance-based specs for emulsions and to encourage the adoption of uniform national standards. So it's the same thing we talked about. So what have we been working on? And the other thing is, so why do we care about AASHTO? And if everybody here, if you have access to the Asphalt Institute website, they have a spec database there for hot mix binder specs by the PG system, and then they have an emulsion spec database. You can go look at every state's full set of emulsion specs, and you'll notice that there's a lot of different specs for the same products across the U.S. And not that that's not okay given the differences in materials in different regions, but there's a very big proliferation of specifications for chip seals, micro, and other things. And if you go and look at all the states, it's pretty easy to see, right? So there is a need from a functional perspective to try to consolidate these specs into something that's a little bit more standardized. And AASHTO has a very good reputation and very good acceptance with the agencies, obviously, on the hot mix side. So moving into AASHTO, taking some of these treatments and moving it into more of a normalized format in AASHTO would actually help in terms of the credibility of the systems themselves. And I think the idea was it would give agencies a little bit more comfort in specifying them and using them, okay? So we got together, we talked about all these different treatments, surface treatments, and the ones that are not highlighted are the ones that have already been worked on. So chip seal, micro, tack coat, fog seal, slurry seal, and cold mixes. We've submitted material specifications, design practices, and construction guide specs, and in some cases, best practice documents for all of these to AASHTO. Or we're still deciding on the best practices if that's going to go through AASHTO or if it's going to go through FHWA. So I talked about this a little earlier, but if you look now in AASHTO, Mike Voth, very early on said, hey, the easiest way for us to get some traction here would be to use the existing M140, which is the anionic emulsion specs. M208 is cationic, and M316 is polymer modified cationic, and update those specs versus trying to write new provisional specs. So that's where the special working group came in, and those have all been updated now to what we would consider currently the state of the practice now, and they've been consolidated and refined. And the other big thing that we did as part of this effort is one thing is notably absent from emulsion treatments that gives us a lot of grief in the technical community, especially with the materials people at the agencies, and that is that we don't incorporate the temperature susceptibility of asphalt, right? So you look at SuperPave and you have climactic temperatures being taken into account in the region that you're in based on LTPP bind, but in emulsions you have a chip seal spec that runs a pen of 100 to 250 on an emulsion that's recovered at 400 Fahrenheit. All right, so we suffer a lack of technical credibility at high levels in the materials group at the DOTs. That's my personal perspective. So all fits together into raising the bar in terms of the technical, evaluation of our products, and then getting into a format that's more uniformly accepted by all the state agencies. So we're trying to bring the level of quality up with this. So in these specs, we now have pin ranges, and the pin ranges are based on LTPP bind data from a study that Gail King did as part of some work for federal highway lands. So he went and looked at a bunch of different asphalts and said, In this region, it's a 6422, and that really corresponds to 40 to 90 pin. And 5828 is 90 to 150, and then minus 34 and lower would be 150 plus, so to speak. So you'll see now in these specs that they have pin ranges and a little bit different designations as opposed to one big range. So now we've got low temperature recovery of emulsions, which is a big step within AASHTO, and we're generating statistical data on that method as we speak. And we've got temperature susceptibility of the asphalt in the basic material standards within AASHTO. So that would be kind of phase one of this ETF effort if you think about it. So the next step would be to take that basic concept and move into something where you would recover at low temperature and maybe test more than, say, just pin or softening point. You might test something like a DSR measurement, right? Now, who knows what that's going to look like? That's phase two, but we're now getting to the point where we're getting through phase one where we can then go back and focus on, performance specification and design standards. So something more performance graded based than empirically based, okay? Microsurfacing, this is Jim Moulthrup's group that he and Gary co-chair. We've submitted the design. The materials would be AASHTO M316. So that's the updated M316. This is a new design spec. There's construction guide spec we've talked about submitting through AASHTO Subcommittee on Construction, or going with an FHWA approach, moving like as a tech brief through there. We also have a larger best practices document that's going to be published through FHWA. So the two to note per se, the top two are the material spec and the design practice, but the construction guide spec is, is also an integral part of this. And then the best practices documents are larger documents that are designed to be references for the contractor and the agency. We've done the same with chip seal. The two biggest treatments that came up in 2013 when we met, everybody kind of says the same thing when you talk about if you're going to work on something in emulsions, what would it be? Chip seal and micro. Those are the first two. So that's what we did first to get our process and procedures down as to how we work with this in committee. So the material spec, the design practice are in, the guide specs, I think with the subcommittee on construction, the best practices have been submitted more recently. So, all right, that took 2 years to get to that point, okay? Now, from a practical perspective, right now it appears that these 3 revisions are going to get published in 2016. That's what it looks like now. We're going to have the votes within the greater AASHTO subcommittee on materials, and they're going to get published. So they're presumably, if everything goes the way we think, these new revisions are going to be in the books for 2016, which is a pretty big step, in the right direction, moving towards a performance graded system for emulsions and residues. And I think Jim and Gary might know a little bit better, but we're still within the tech section 2A on revisions to the micro design and maybe the construction guide specs, because these are brand new. They're not existing documents that are just being modified, which is a little bit different procedure, but they're coming along and have been through some revisions. Now, for slurry seals, fog seals, tack coat's not on here, but we've submitted that too. We have the design practice and the material specifications. They've all been submitted to AASHTO as well. That's relatively recent, so that's at the initial stages. So probably when you get feedback from the tech section 2A, then you have to do revisions and address comments, and then it goes back to 2A, then they sign off for it, then it goes back to the subcommittee on materials for a full ballot. So there's Robinson's rules of order going on here, which takes time, right? And so I'm guessing maybe if we're lucky and we get all the issues addressed and comments addressed, we might be looking at 2017 of having all of these systems with design specifications, construction guide specs, best practices published either in AASHTO or some other avenue. So we don't need to go over that, but the other one of the focal points for this year from Colin, who's the chairman of the committee, and I work for Colin, is he really wanted to focus on, this has come up in a number of instances, I think, talking with agencies and contractors in general, at least in my experience so far in the industry, is, well, you can make the best material in the world and have the best material spec and the best design, but if it doesn't get placed right, then all that goes out the window. So it's kind of seems cliche a little bit, but it's true. So one of the things that Colin wanted to focus on this year, in particular within our group, was within this quality assurance and supplier certification subcommittee, was basically QA/QC and coming up with documents and plans around, how to test the emulsion, test aggregate, work with the emulsions producers, contractors on training, certification, these kinds of things. So it's a pretty in-depth. We last met as a group, the ETF, in June in Denver, and we spent, a 40%, at least a third of the time talking about QC, QA, and certification, and coming up with, people to work on the subcommittee and address these issues, which also includes, education and training as well. And Jason talked about some of this that's already available for some of the treatments online now through NHI and TCC and others. So that's a big focal point now. Todd Shields is running that from Indiana DOT, is running that subcommittee. Tom Wood was the co-chair, but I think he's heading for retirement, so we're looking for someone to replace him on the ETF at some point here. But you can see, from 2013, from getting together to 2015, we've made quite a lot of progress in terms of getting standards into AASHTO, getting them reviewed, and actually about to be published. So, and we've covered a lot of treatments. The other thing I would mention is Steve Cross and Todd Thomas have done a lot of work, getting a cold in place recycling design practice submitted to AASHTO, which is a big step, because I don't think there was anything of that kind in AASHTO anywhere, and it was really kind of handled through ARRA and some other at the state level. So we've tackled some new things. We've dealt with some issues that have been out there for a while, and we're heading hopefully towards long term more of a surface performance graded system for emulsions and residues, not necessarily to look exactly like hot mix binders or PG binders, but whatever we decide as an industry and academia and the state agencies and the contracting community, it should look like. But ultimately, probably something different than today, where we're testing, pen and softening point only, that kind of thing on an emulsion that's recovered at high temperature. So we've made a lot of progress. Now, the PPETG just recently met again in September. If anybody has specific questions on that, I think Jason can answer those because he was there, Jason Dietz from FHWA. And they have now, it looks like they're reforming and re-energizing and coming up with a new mission statement, and it appears at this point that we will roll back, the ETF will roll back under the PPETG in some fashion, maybe not exactly the same as we were pre-2011, but under some organizational structure there, and continue to operate out from under, PPETG out of Washington. So with that, I think I'll finish up. I think I'm on time. Am I on time? Right on time. Nice. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them specifically or generally about this whole effort or anything about the specs, anything you want to know. Thank you.